Louis, we just left off and I said, it's hard to believe that people wouldn't want U.S. treasuries. And when I say people, I mean largest economies in the world. But, you also write, and this did shock everybody, and if it didn't, it should, that Saudi Arabia floated the idea of pricing their oil in renminbi. And why should that be so shocking to people?
It should be shocking because we've lived in a world that has been all basically US dollar centric. You wanted to buy commodities, you had to save US dollars to buy them, which meant you had to sell stuff to the US first. But this is changing right in front of our eyes. Russia is now basically telling China, hey, you can buy my commodities in renminbi. It's telling India, hey, you can buy my commodities in rupees. And so, indeed, I think if you're Saudi Arabia, it puts you in a tough bind because China and India are obviously the world's, amongst the world's largest energy importers, and it's the world's fastest growing markets if you're an energy exporter. So, do you want to be cut off from those markets? And if you don't, maybe you have to match Russia's terms.
Yeah.
And so, we are perhaps witnessing a profound shift in the global financial architecture.
And Louis, I want to pick it up as well, because what's interesting in terms of this dynamic shift that's occurring is you write that having the cheapest cost of energy is so key and critical in terms of which economies are going to win. And if China can strike a deal with Russia in terms of a very cheap cost of energy and priced in renminbi, where does that lead China from an economic perspective versus the United States?
Look, Catherine, that's a great point. Economic activity is mostly energy transformed. And, with that in mind, I think people underestimate that the extent to which the greatest macro development of the past 10 years was the US shale revolution. The fact that the US had all of a sudden an absolute collapse in its cost of energy that brought it much cheaper than anybody else. Natural gas falling from $10 to $2.50 meant that not only inflation was low in the US, not only did the US trade balance improve dramatically, but the US dollar was strong on the back of this, all of which allowed the Fed to stay easier for longer. This is now, of course, over. In the past 2 years, the Fed has moved from producing 13 million barrels per day to 11.8 million barrels per day. The economic benefits of the US shale revolution are now over, begging the question of who over the next 10 years is going to be the cheapest energy producer. From basically 2000 to 2011, China was the world's cheapest energy producer because it produced most of its electricity with its cheap domestic and highly polluting coal. Then China decided to freeze coal because it was just too disgusting. And then the US became the world's cheapest energy producer. So who's going to be the cheap energy producer or consumer, I should say, over the next decade? I think before the Ukraine war, there was a case that it might be Europe. Thanks to Nord Stream 2, Europe had perhaps the possibility to not only tap into Russian natural gas, but to tap into that natural gas and have it priced in euros, which basically would have meant for Europe that it was almost free. You get the natural gas from Russia for euros, and then Russia recycles these euros into your own domestic bonds. So Europe was actually looking not so bad up until 2 months ago. Europe now looks an absolute disaster. And instead, Europe's loss is China's gain. All of a sudden, all the energy that was going to go to Europe will now be going to China. China will be buying it at a discount and paying for it in renminbi. So as you think, okay, who gets the cheap cost of energy for the next 10 years? It could well be China, because first, China is now reopening its coal mines and started to do that last summer. And Chinese coal production has moved from 300 million metric tons to 400 million metric tons. So they're going to have by far the cheapest cost of of electricity. And then on top of that, they're going to get the cheap Russian energy. So in this sort of energy geopolitical world of ours, the balance has just shifted to China.
So what does that mean then from an economic perspective or an investment perspective? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next segment. But does it mean then that, because you also talk a little bit about perhaps owning more gold, just
Yeah.
given the freezing of assets. I'm kind of jumping a bit, but
No, but I think the first thing it means is if you're BASF or if you're DuPont, you're setting up your next petrochem plant, not in Europe, definitely in China, because you know that China will be the place where you get a secure and cheap source of energy for the next 10 years.
understood.
Yeah.
Yeah.